Thank you all in the audience for joining us today for this week's virtual panel, Insuring a Driverless Vehicle. Insurance has been intertwined with driving for well over 100 years. And as automated driving technology becomes more prevalent, there are lots of questions on what the process might mean for insuring vehicles. Today, we've gathered a few experts to shed some light on this topic. As a reminder, you'll be able to find the full recording of this panel after it ends, as well as all of our previous virtual panels on our YouTube channel, website at www.pavecampaign.org, or social media at PaveCampaign. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tabitha Colter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and the moderator for today's panel. We have three great guests today that we're thrilled to have participating. First up, we have Jackie Erickson, Senior Director of Communications at Edge Case Research. Jackie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And our second panelist is Max Libman, Underwriting Consultant for Sharing Economy at Liberty Mutual Insurance. Max, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
And finally, we have Steve Miller, Innovation Lead at Insurance Office of America. Steve, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again, all three of you, for joining us here at PAVE today for this conversation on AVs and insurance. Max, I was hoping you could start us off by talking about how the insurance industry thinks about insuring AVs today.
Sure. So it's a very interesting question. You know, we in Liberty Mutual are very excited about this space, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think holistically, if you think first regarding the safety aspect, right, and if we take a look back in 2019, injuries from auto accidents resulted in about $463 billion of claims, right? There was one injury every 7 seconds. There was one death every 13 minutes, right? So you fast forward a little bit to 2020, and we know what happened with COVID. And so you would think that would all drop pretty substantially. But something interesting happened. And while miles were down, you know, about 14.5%, we saw fatalities creep up about 4.6%. And there's a couple of reasons why that all happened, right? So some of that was distracted driving. There was less folks on the road, speeding, driving while impaired. And if you look back over the course of time, you know, 50 years ago, there was about 5.2 deaths for every 100 million miles. And by 2019, that dropped to about 1.2 deaths. And by 2050, that's projected to drop again to half a death. And really, the goal of AVs is this vision zero, you know, so no deaths at all. And that's what we're all striving for. And that's great. And I think, you know, those are really important reasons why we're all very excited about this. But it's not all altruistic, right? McKinsey projects that this is $1 trillion global market. Boston Consulting Group, Capgemini, peg that at 60 to 75 billion in the US. And so we see this combination of continued focus on safety, reducing fatalities, but also improving accessibility and equity that come along with AVs as really important, and why we're very, very excited to participate in this space. Liberty in general set up a mobility pod several years ago, and we bring together all of the great resources that within our own company to focus on autonomous vehicles and the sharing economy, right? So we bring all of our claims, actuarial, telematics, risk control, public affairs, our partnerships teams, our personal lines teams into one group where we can really focus on how to solve for these very challenging and complex problems. So we are really looking forward to, you know, help this industry grow and succeed.
One of the great things about Liberty is that they've got a strategic group that's thinking about the future and how these, you know, how this technology can enable a greater measure of safety. When we're talking about insuring autonomous vehicles today, from a commercial aspect, it's really the question of partnership and investment, and these insurance carriers such as Liberty taking the stance that these AVs that are in testing are at least as safe as a human driver, right? Because we have legacy rates that are filed that are predicated on human driving. So as we build up a better track record and actuarial data and see the safety and efficacy, we will see the insuring rates change, the policy structure change towards that future goal of, you know, a higher level of automation and safety.
I can chime in just to acknowledge, you know, the partnership that Edge Case Research has with Liberty Mutual as they're thinking very innovatively and reaching out to us to understand, you know, how our safety expertise and our tools can help them get more clarity on risk when it comes to this new technology in the AV space. So it has been a great partnership with Liberty Mutual.
great. Thank you all. That's a really helpful, I think, background for everybody to know where you all are coming from. Steve, I'd like to go off of some of what you were saying and ask you a little bit more about what role does insurance play in the AV market?
Sure. Well, number one, we're an enabler and a solutions provider, right? Insurance is not the topic 1A that everybody coming into autonomy thinks about. You're trying to teach artificial intelligence to drive a vehicle, right? But you've got contractual obligations that have to be met. Insurance can help with safety and best practices, as well as a regulatory interface as the entire industry moves forward. Now, the role as we see it with a broker and a carrier is the broker's job is to understand, be an expert resource, and tell the story of the AV company to the broader marketplace, right? To create very deep relationships that allow facilitation of partnerships. And we've seen that with Liberty Mutual and others that are coming into this space. It's not yet hit critical mass of revenue where insurance carriers have been falling over themselves to take on a brand new risk. But there are a subset of carriers that are interested because they see the potential for safety, for growth, and they're almost acting as investors in the space, actually quite literally in certain cases where investment arms exist on the insurance carrier side.
So I think Steve said that great. I think one of the things that we as insurance carriers and professionals try to do is we are looking to enable innovation, right? And we've done that throughout history. Insurance, we insured the first auto in 1897, the first airplanes in 1919, the first space flights in 1960, right? The idea behind insurance is to answer the question, what happens when things go wrong, right? And so you need partners who are able to respond and help this technology grow. And ultimately, again, it goes back to the point of this will, enable the ability to save lives, right? So that's what I think we're all trying to do here.
Yeah, the reality is I don't ever want to be on the other end of a phone call where a founder is saying, we can't continue our operations until we find insurance. But on the other side, it's brand new and innovative. So it takes some relationships, some massaging, some sharing of knowledge to get to that point.
Thank you both. And going off of what Max is actually just talking about in terms of saving lives, I think the concepts of safety and insurance often go hand in hand. So Jackie, I wanted to turn to you and looking at it from your perspective, what can the government do to help with the safety of AVs?
Yes, and that's a good question. At Edge Case Research, we sit in a very interesting space when it comes to autonomous vehicles because we work with OEMs and tier ones and full stacks, insurance, and governments have been engaging with us a lot more, along with standards development organizations. So we have very interesting insights. And lately, from a government perspective, because what we've seen is that insurance, when we first started to have conversations with insurance partners, that was their question, what's the government doing? And at this point, because there has been some changes, there's three things that the government can do today without any deep regulations. And I'll just focus on three things: standards, transparency, and a safety first approach. So basically, as we know from a standards perspective, is that all governments are engaged in AV testing from a local, state, from the federal. We work with international governments, and the thing that they can encourage is conformance to the normative safety standards that are already written by the automotive industry and their stakeholders. So we hear about the standards development organizations that have published standards such as ISO 26262, 21448, ANSI UL 4600. Most recently, because we're in a state of on-road testing, SAE republished J3018 as guidelines for on-road testing. So what local governments can do is be able to hold the companies accountable for the standards that they've written and they've published and supported. So that's one thing. Another thing is around transparency. I think from an insurance perspective, government perspective, we all want a little bit more transparency. It helps them with an underwriting risk policy aspect as well. And so we see at the federal level is that there's the attempt for the VSSAs to give more transparency around safety. But really what NHTSA needs to do is to request more technically substantive information and also get more engagement. There's not many VSSAs currently published. But the one thing we can do is look at best practices of what we've seen so far. And I'll take a step back and go Uber ATG. They're now acquired by Aurora, but they had best practices where they were very transparent about their safety case framework. They put it on their website. They showed their high-level safety goals. They were public about working with our company to conform to 4600 with that framework. So they have identified standards that they're conforming to and being transparent about it. So we can take a look and use that as a model. And then lastly, I think what's really important is that we need to take a safety first approach, and that, you know, governments should stress to all companies that we shouldn't compete on safety, and that they can facilitate a dialogue really around how safe is safe enough, and that the discussion should be around these relevant metrics that focus more on safety than the race to deployment. So we feel that with these three things, standards, transparency, safety first approach, these are the things that governments can do today that will help from an insurance perspective, government perspective, and from a public perception perspective.
And so that's incredibly interesting. The how safe is safe enough. So there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal in April that talked a little bit about this. And one of the key takeaways was, you know, they surveyed their readers, and if AVs were to eliminate 10% of all crashes today, how many people would be willing to adopt them? And only 11% of respondents would be willing to adopt them if AVs were only 10% safer than traditional vehicles. So there's this perception problem. I mean, they went on to say, well, what if they were 50% safer? And then it was only 37% of respondents would adopt them. Right? We're talking about 50% safer than today's vehicles. So there's this expectation bias, right? The superiority bias. We think we are better drivers than the guy next to us, even though, you know, we might be terrible drivers, and we expect the AV, even though it might at some point be empirically proven that it's a better driver, that unless it's perfect, that people are unwilling to get into them. And so this is where I think government really can step in to help improve that visibility, right, and acceptability.
It's an education gap.
There's a lot of, you know, discussion going on, as you say, is that there's a lot of potential. And I think what we like to do is really point to the evidence. And we look forward to those conversations that government can hold to point to evidence that show the potential is there.
Evidence and then public perception, right? I loathe those surveys, as insightful as they are, because they say, what about, how would you feel about autonomous vehicles if it saves 10% of fatalities? But it doesn't give any background or a knowledge base as to what that means, right? So that's where I think PAVE and all of us can really make an improvement in educating the public on how these vehicles work and how they are safe, and just push everything forward.
Definitely. I'd actually like to stay with this topic of safety for a little bit and kind of get to the perspective of, you know, how does the insurance industry evaluate safety of AVs today? I know that that criteria might look different from how AV companies think about safety. Max, could you start us off on that one?
Yeah, of course. So, you know, I think it's interesting. I think we've all come to some realization that commercialization is probably further out than any of us expected. And really, even once these AVs are on the road, there's going to be some period of time, 5, 10 plus years, where you're going to have this mixed fleet of both human drivers and AV drivers, right? So we are ultimately today trying to understand how technology is better, how the AV driver is better than a traditional human driver. And we have a good understanding of the risk likelihood of the traditional human driver on the road today. We utilize traditional risk management principles, safety principles, and we have billions of miles of traditional telematics data on our human fleet. The challenge is we don't have nearly as many miles on the autonomous fleets to be able to have any significant level of credibility to be able to say, yes, 100% these vehicles are significantly safer. So today we use a two-pronged approach. Prong one is we evaluate traditional risk management metrics, best practices, as you heard Jackie talk about. And then the second part of the approach is partnering with companies like EdgeCase and others who can help us validate the actual technology. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. I'm not a, engineer, so I can't get under the hood and understand what the software is. And so we need, some handholding with that. But coupled together, we start to have a really good understanding of who the winners and losers are in this space, and we can make some, critical judgments there.
And to put a fine point on that, it's not even that commercialization is further out than we anticipated. It's that commercialization in the robotaxi fleet aspect, as was in the media in 2018 and 2019, might be further out. But there's iterative steps along the way where you're going to get low-speed electric vehicles at airports or on college campuses. You're going to have your DoorDash delivered in a bot. You're going to have ADAS that's next level in last mile trucking and maybe some cargo delivery applications. So the industry is pivoted and grown. But then when you look at how autonomous vehicle companies are viewing insurance, they're viewing it as how can they come and be a disruptor and a provider of next level solutions. So, first goal is let's make traffic safer, let's reduce fatalities, right? But along with that is a reduction in frequency and severity of losses, which should inure to less expensive auto insurance, right? So as we get the data that Max is talking about and the miles driven, then we start to look at how does the industry pivot towards a usage-based model? How can these companies integrate insurance as an offering, as a vertical, and a potential revenue stream?
Tabitha, I'd like to kind of go back to, one of the first parts of the questions is, when you ask, how do AV companies think about safety? And, when we're working with AV companies, what we're trying to do is really integrate safety. And I think this definitely helps from the insurance perspective as well, is really integrate it from the ground up. I mean, right now is the best time to integrate safety because we're in a testing mode. So good engineering rigor, good testing, operational feedback, and also a safety culture. But I think the thing that will help Steve and also, help Max and other insurance is when we are really pushing a safety case approach that gives, again, back to transparency. For those in the audience that may not be familiar with a safety case, it's a structured argument that's supported by evidence justifying that a system is acceptably safe for intended use. But at the high level, it tells you three things: why you may believe that you are safe, what you mean by safe, what you believe you are safe, and the evidence that shows the safety of the vehicle. And these three baseline things will be able to allow companies to define what is acceptably safe for them. Why do they believe that they are safe? And here's the evidence to prove that. Because I think as we start to kind of move forward on how AVs think about safety, going back to transparency, going back to the ATG approach to putting things on websites, is being more clear about what safety means. Not just a marketing tool that you can put on a VSSA and say we're safe. It's actually showing the evidence via safety case approach that will tie everything together.
Absolutely, yeah, safety is crucial. And I do have to put in a brief plug that we did a PAVE panel with one of Jackie's colleagues at EdgeCase Research earlier this year that is in our database on safety cases, if you want to go check that out. Yeah, this is super helpful from all of you. Thank you so much. And speaking of the AV industry and the companies, I'm curious, looking out over the next 2 to 5 years or so of the development that's going to take place with AV companies, Steve, what is the insurance industry doing to address the needs that those companies might have?
Right, so let's take a look at where the industry is going over the next 2 to 5 years, right? We're going to have commercialization. We're going to see more consolidation in the form of acquisitions. And we're also going to see a pipeline of new startups around the periphery, right? V2I, wearables, a whole slew of other areas that need to build out for success here. The insurance industry is going to pivot in its response, in that we've addressed first-party testing. And now we're going towards commercialization, which involves a third party and changes the liability. So you're going to see a growth in the need for product liability, technology errors and omissions, and the integration between those two, either in the form of a carrier that is offering both coverages and or some bespoke forms that are created specific to the industry and its exposures. Beyond that, because the traditional industry does take a lot of actuarial data to feel comfortable with the risk, we may hit inflection points where traditional routes are not the most appropriate for an autonomous vehicle company scaling. You might look at alternate risk transfer in the form of large retentions, captive arrangements, fronting arrangements, or deeper carrier integration and partnership. Any way you slice it, as the AV companies mature, they're going to be taking on additional risk which is natural because they are going to be best suited to understand the efficacy of their safety and their particular risk.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Steve. I think one of the things we've been working on together and with some of our other partners is how do we develop these new products of the future? How do we think through these integrated forms? And then I think there's also this perspective of, and we touched on it briefly, it's like, how do you benchmark all of this, right? So today, AVs really want to benchmark themselves from a safety case towards traditional drivers, and that's really important for them from both a marketing perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, and to validate their own safety cases. But in the future, as more data starts to come in, as more vehicles are connected, as both traditional driving human-powered vehicles have telematics as well as AVs in the shared space, there may be more interesting opportunities of, if I'm a bad driver and I have a history of hard braking and my vehicle is telematics enabled and is connected and it knows that, it tells the AV that, hey, you may want to be careful if you're next to Max because he may do something stupid. And so there's all these very interesting approaches that could occur and how we can create models and pricing to adjust for all the variability and the different conditions. So it's a pretty exciting space.
That's really interesting. Going off of that, actually, Max, are there certain segments within autonomy that the insurance industry is particularly focused on, and maybe why would that be the case?
Yeah, so there definitely are, and I think it varies from carrier to carrier, and different companies have different niches where they think they're very successful in. And Liberty, we play in a couple of different areas, everything from, as Steve mentioned, research and development to ride hail, to trucking, to delivery robots and owner operators. I think we are exploring some of the other avenues, some of the periphery of the AV marketplace that Steve had mentioned, but we focus on that initial subset of 5 buckets, if you will. But there are definitely carriers that play more in software as a service and mobility as a service and the hardware side of things. And there's space for everyone, right? And that's why you have guys like Steve who know this market inside and out and can help you navigate.
Yeah. And Steve, what do you see there within the whole industry?
Well, it's really segmented by type of coverage, and that's where carriers have appetite, right? What Max is referencing is many carriers have a focus on auto fleets, and Liberty is fantastic at that. When you look at other applications, mobility as a service or delivery bots, it's a little bit in the insurance weeds, but those don't fit into auto liability. They fit into general liability. Different rates, different policy structure, different applications and consequences as a result. So that really breaks it down. I'd say the better question where you're looking at
I think we're having a couple technical issues with Steve. I wasn't sure if it was on my end or overall, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of pivot into the next question. This is kind of for everybody. What are things that AV companies need to be mindful of, or to successfully manage their risk now or in the future as they continue? Jackie, maybe you could start us off.
I think basically they need to acknowledge and just be realistic about the fact that the real world is kind of a crazy place. It's hard for humans. And once you start to add software into it and their learning and their training, they need to be mindful of the risks of the things that maybe they haven't thought about. So one thing at EdgeCase is that we have some social media posts that are called, "Did you think of that?" And these are these weird objects that kind of appear on roadways. And this is kind of the Achilles heel of the technology. It is bad at knowing when it doesn't know what's going to happen next. And these are the things that the companies are going to have to learn how to manage and have a solid plan for when their vehicle interacts with something it didn't prepare for. and how do you do something to keep it safe? And so they're going to have to constantly be preparing for that and training for that and knowing how to respond to that in a safe way.
Absolutely. And then Max, same question to you. What are things AV companies should be mindful of to successfully manage their risk now or in the future?
Right. So I think I echo everything Jackie said. I also think from an insurance perspective, there's a couple of things that probably we all need to keep in mind. There's this prevailing sentiment to try to push rates down as much as possible, right? And we can all understand that. And the business model, the getting your fixed costs down is incredibly important. And after, we've had a soft market for a significant number of years, the insurance industry in general has moved into this very, very hard market. Prices are rapidly going up, limits are decreasing. And so that really means that we need to have a much closer working relationship with our client partners, with our broker partners, with our technology partners, to try to really understand the risk much more holistically. And really, that does a couple of things. One, it helps us pivot and launch new products as our clients move into new industries or segments, which ultimately will allow them to succeed. But also, it helps shift the focus on total cost of risk, right? It's really, really important to get your fixed cost down. Everyone can agree, but I think it's as equally as important to partner with a company or an insurance company who really understands this space, not just from an underwriting perspective, but also who has the right risk control people in place who can help you with best practices, who has the right claims folks in place, who understand how adjudication works and which parties are responsible for what. Ultimately, and especially as you heard Steve talk about earlier, some of these alternative financing arrangements, captive, self-insurance, that's going to play a significantly bigger part of the equation than the fixed cost that you pay for your premium. And so that I think is from a big picture, something that we should all keep in mind. It's how do we partner together? Welcome back, Steve.
Absolutely. Yeah, welcome back, Steve. Just in time for me to put you on the spot with the question.
You have to love having a technology lead title and having the technology just die on you in the middle.
Happens to all of us. So Steve, Max and Jackie were just helping to give an answer, and I'd love to get your take on, what are things that AV companies need to be mindful of to successfully manage their risk now or in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to be very mindful of the collaboration that needs to happen, right? What we really want to avoid is sort of what was going on with Detroit and Silicon Valley 10 years ago, which is each thinking that they had a solution and didn't need the other. As we go forward, we see that they both bring unique skill sets to the table to enable our autonomy and mobility revolution. Very much the same with insurance providers and autonomous vehicle companies right now. Each can bring some very unique things to the table that can enable the success of both.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, we're getting near to time, but I'd love to wrap up with kind of a final sort of fun question of asking you all, what excites you the most about the evolution of the AV industry? I feel like during this panel, we've talked about so many different things that are on the horizon and might come in the future, but I'd love to get your take on what sort of excites you the most. Jackie, if you want to start us off.
Well, every panel that I do, I have to integrate my children into that. So really, honestly, what excites me most is that my kids get really excited when they think about the future of technology. And so being a part of an innovative space that is going to help my children, whether, again, they love the idea of delivery robots bringing their toys to their front door, or literally eating pizza while the car drives them to baseball practice. And the fact that they debate me over, Tesla self-driving and autopilot every single day in the back of my car, they're engaged, they're excited about it. So what gets me excited is the excitement on my boys' face. So I will ask, all of those folks out there that are designing these cars, keep the kids in mind. They're excited about it. So that's my personal plug.
Thank you, Steve. Any final thoughts there?
Yeah, 6 years ago, I was like, this is great. My two older kids aren't going to have to learn to drive. Well, they're 11 and 14 now. They're going to have a license. I'm holding out hope for my 5-year-old because nobody wants him behind the wheel of an automobile and in control or out of control. But yeah, the whole scope of this is exciting for us, especially with my team and the innovation group. It's our passion. It's an area where honestly, if we're talking to friends and we say insurance, if we say autonomous vehicle quickly enough, they don't glaze over and back away. So, you know, we love the space and everything that it entails.
Great. And Max, do you want to bring us home?
Sure, yeah. So from an insurance company perspective, obviously we've talked about some of this stuff. We think there's a lot of benefits, reducing crashes, saving lives. There's also a ton of equity that we think it'll bring to the space, right? The underserved communities, and making sure the transportation is available to them. There's, you know, the eco benefits, right? Most of these vehicles are going to be electric. There's going to be reductions in emissions. And then there's like the selfish benefits. I'm the chief chauffeur officer of my family, right? And so my wife hates to drive, and I've been driving for the last 20 years everywhere we go. So if I could get that, you know, chore removed from me, I think I'd be pretty excited.
Great. Well, those 30 minutes went fast, but Jackie, Steve, Max, thank you all again for taking the time to join us this afternoon for this fascinating topic.
Thanks for having us.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
And a big
folks.
thank you to our live audience and everybody who submitted questions in advance. If you'd like to follow up with PAVE or one of the panelists on this topic, please reach out to us via our website contact form or just reply to your registration email. And as a reminder, we will post that full video recording on our YouTube channel and website later this afternoon. Follow us on social media at PAVE Campaign to see that as soon as it's released. And please do join us next Wednesday for a special conversation entitled Helping the Public Sector Prepare for AVs. PAVE is hosting our first educational workshop for public sector officials across the state of Ohio next Monday and Tuesday, and we'll be following up with that event with a panel to take a look at how the workshop went. Registration is now available at pavecampaign.org/events. Thank you all.